Welcome to Aspire, and I Have the Right To podcast, where we amplify voices, share stories, and drive change in the fight against sexual assault. We explore the critical issues surrounding student safety, institutional accountability, and survivor empowerment. In every episode, our goal is to provide insightful conversations with survivors, experts, educators, and advocates, giving you, our listener, valuable information, resources, and actionable steps to create safer environments and cultivate a culture of respect and consent. Welcome back to Aspire by I Have the Right To. I'm Katie Shipp, Executive Director at I Have the Right To, and I'm joined by our co-founder, Chessy Prout.
Hi everyone, today is extra exciting because we have a brand new voice joining us. We're thrilled to welcome Charlotte, a senior at Georgetown Day School here in DC, who will be co-hosting with us for the very first time.
Hi everyone, I'm interning with I Have the Right To this summer, and I'm so excited to help amplify these important conversations with Katie and Chessy.
And what a guest to kick off Charlotte's co-hosting debut. Today we're joined by the incredible Ray Epstein. Ray recently graduated from Temple University, where she double majored in English and Communication and Social Influence with a minor in Sociology.
Ray's activism began back in middle school, and she's since become a powerhouse advocate for preventing sexual violence. At Temple, she founded and served as the president of the university's chapter of It's On Us, Student Activists Against Sexual Assault, leading initiatives that won awards like Student Organization of the Year.
And that's just the beginning. Ray also served on the Student Leadership Council, the Temple University Police Department Student Advisory Board, and even chaired the first ever LGBTQ+ caucus on the It's Us National. Last year alone, she was named a Truman Scholar, elected student body president, and recognized as a 2024 iconic Philly woman.
We're so excited to talk to Ray about her journey as an activist, the power of student leadership, and how she's building safer, more inclusive communities everywhere she goes. Ray, welcome to Aspire.
Thank you. Hi, everyone.
Ray, we're so thankful that you were able to join us today, and congratulations on your recent graduation.
Thank you.
It's really incredible what you've been able to accomplish so far, and I know you have big plans for the future. But before we get started on that, can you share with our listeners what motivated you to get into this work and a bit about your journey?
Absolutely. So I got involved in the anti-sexual assault space when I was in middle school, which I think is somewhat of a non-traditional entry point or a young entry point for a lot of people. But I was lucky enough to grow up in Washington, D.C., which is a place that's full of opportunities, especially for young people, and I think has been a bit ahead of other states in providing opportunities and entry points for people who are younger and elevating those voices. But when I was in 7th grade, I entered my first relationship, and that quickly became very, very abusive, and it wasn't something I recognized until it sort of began to end after around 5 or 6 months, around the summer before 8th grade. And it was a relationship of sexual abuse and of physical abuse and of emotional abuse. And once it ended, I started receiving death threats from my abuser about seeing me again when we began attending school again in the fall. And I reported those death threats, but not the instances of sexual or physical abuse, because I didn't recognize it for what it was. And I didn't have the verbiage to articulate what it was. All I had was the messages that felt like clear evidence of something being wrong. And when I reported to my middle school that I was receiving death threats from this person, they said that the most they could do was isolate us from each other in some of our classes because it was a 20-person grade. So it was very, very difficult to fully isolate us from each other. But beyond that, there was no punishment besides telling him to stop threatening me and telling me that it wasn't that serious and things would likely not escalate. But in skills-based classes, we were on the same level. So we were in science and we were in Spanish together. And alphabetically was how they arranged seating. And so we would sit next to each other because of our last names. And I remember the first day of 8th grade when I saw him for the first time again after having some distance from what had happened. I just completely, my knees buckled and I felt like something was wrong in my body, but I still couldn't articulate or understand fully what was wrong. And I remember I ran away to the bathroom and I locked myself in a stall for the rest of the day. It was an orientation day and I just didn't come out. And I called my mom and I was like, something is wrong. And she asked me, did he do something to you? And I just suddenly felt like I understood what was wrong and how to explain it to my mom because somebody asked, which is such a rare thing to have. And I feel so lucky that she was willing to ask me and knew to ask me and asked me in a way that made me feel safe to tell her. And she said, I want you to get off the phone and I want you to go downstairs to the principal's office and I want you to tell him what happened and then I'm going to come pick you up. And so I went to the principal's office and I immediately was just faced with disbelief again. And while I was waiting for my mom to come pick me up, I went to my guidance counselor's office where she asked me if I knew what consent was. And I said yes, in a basic sense, I knew what consent was. And she asked me if I ever held my first boyfriend's hand without asking every single time. And I said, yes, he was my boyfriend. Of course I held his hand. And she said, well, he could easily accuse you of assault, so you should be careful what you accuse people of yourself. And I think that was such a formative experience to have that be the first response besides that phone call saying to go to the office to my sexual assault and to just a relationship of such extensive and long-term abuse. And ultimately, I was forced out of my middle school and forced to finish 8th grade from home because of retaliation from my institution, but also from my peers and my teachers, and really everyone who was a part of that system and made it up. And in that time, I really wanted to channel my kind of rage and resentment into something empowering and transform that experience. Otherwise, I probably would have just been sitting in bed and doing math problems and feeling hopeless. And so I ended up interning at an anti-teen dating violence organization, which no longer exists, unfortunately. It closed down during COVID, but it's called Break the Cycle. And I worked there all the way through high school, which was a really, really amazing entry point for me. And they treated me like an adult on equal playing field. They let me shadow client intake. They let me help organize the DC Ven resource chart that's given to domestic violence victims when they come forward in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area. And that was kind of my anchor and my saving grace in high school because my abuser ended up attending the same high school as me, which just led to so much more pervasive and I think residual trauma.
I'm so sorry, Ray, that you went through that. I just thank you for sharing that with our listeners.
I was wondering how you might think consent education in your health class in middle school may have helped you realize what you had gone through and what level of information you think is maybe too early to teach in middle school.
Absolutely. I think it's so important that we do teach consent from a young age. And I think that there are ways to teach consent beyond a sexual context, right? And so if we start really young and we start with games like red light, green light even, that's a really good way to give kids the right tools to understand when it is right to move forward, when it is not right, and to give them kind of a framework for understanding it. And there's also ways to have children in the classroom practice consent in asking for scissors, in sharing toys that are available to them, in sharing school supplies. And for me, at my middle school and beforehand, there was just no education like that whatsoever. The most sex education I had was the basic anatomical ways in which sex transpires, and that I shouldn't do it for a long time. It wasn't really celibate sex ed or abstinence only, but it was, this is something that is far off in all of your futures, even though kids in my class were sexually active, not including myself because I really had a minimal understanding of how any of that worked before that relationship, which was definitely a imbalance, I think, in that relationship. But we had never learned what consent was in my classroom. My mom had definitely instilled some understanding of it with me because she works in the domestic violence space, but I doubt my classmates had the same experience.
Yeah, I'm a firm believer that we need to start those conversations early. I have a 4-year-old and an 8-year-old, and I talk about it often because I want people to understand you can start these conversations so young. It can be something as simple as if they say no when you're tickling them, even if they're laughing and they want you to continue, you stop and you respect that no. Or even, between siblings, if you hear a no or a stop, just teaching them what consent is and respecting body boundaries and also feeling empowered to speak up. So I agree. I think the earlier the better, and you can talk about consent and boundaries in ways that isn't necessarily about sex, right? But then as they get older, you expand the conversation. I think it's really important. It's interesting because in our work, we find it easy to get into high schools, but then we really push and are pushing more to get in younger. Schools are starting to open up to it. We definitely have some school partners that are, but there is definitely a hesitancy, even if the school sees that it's necessary, the pushback that sometimes happens from parents. I definitely see it less now than when I first started working in this space. I think parents are a little bit more aware now and wanting to understand. I have a friend who has a teenage daughter, and she said, "Oh, I haven't had these conversations yet because she hasn't got her period yet." And I thought, what does that have to do with anything? Like, you should start having these conversations so early on, because if you wait until then, it could be too late. So thank you, Ray, for sharing that.
You mentioned as well that when you had gone to the school about your experience, you said that they said something like, if you held their hand too, like that was, she could say the same thing about you. Did you feel like that response was invalidating to your feelings, and how do you feel like that shaped your own journey?
I definitely felt like it was invalidating, and it was terrifying, because to me, this was, again, a concept I was pretty unfamiliar with beyond just consent meant yes and no, and that those were supposed to not be a gray area. They were supposed to be direct and firm. And so when they told me that I had violated him in that way, and that meant that I had done that, I felt terrible, and I felt like a perpetrator. It was a really, really hard moment for me to move past, and something that I think is still a really big part of me to this day, and something that I'm still trying to move past at times, because it just completely formulated the way that I viewed my own experience with sexual assault and the way that I view myself, and made me not trust myself and made me doubt my own story as important, because it made me feel like I was somebody who was contributing just as much harm, if not more, and that what I had to say was irrelevant and not important.
That's such a clear instance, too, of DARVO, of deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender, a term that I, had no idea about when I was going through what I was going through. But it's so obvious when you see it happening in all of these instances, and it's so devastating that is a trusted adult's first response to a young survivor coming to them with their experience. But I'd hope that adults are getting more and more information due to the public shift in, conversation about a consent culture versus rape culture. But thank you so much for sharing that. And I hope that is not, the case. And I hope you can feel that deep inside, because I do know how long that sort of feeling of guilt and shame can last. And I hope we can at least try to impart, or at least emphasize to you that, that was totally inappropriate of them and not your fault.
You also mentioned, when I think sharing this story in an article from January of this year, that kind of recently, like, your decision to move back home post-grad was riddled with the anxiety of facing your high school peers. You had mentioned how you went to high school with your abuser, and in that article said that he told anyone that would listen that you had lied about being assaulted. What advice would you give to high school students or college students who might be dealing with this, and in turn struggling to really have a voice?
I think I went to high school in a different landscape than a lot of the current generation. And so it's a little bit of a different circumstance, but I also think rape culture is always going to be, or at least currently still is, obviously very prevalent. And so the same instance could transpire. And I would say the thing that was most blocking me from finding help and seeking support was that I felt like I had this experience of middle school and middle school graduation and finishing with my peers at a school that I've been at since I was 2, ripped away from me. And so at my high school, even though it's unfair that I was in a position where I'd be happier at a different institution, I felt this determination and this really, really strong mindset that I had to stick it out for all 4 years at that school, even though I was miserable, even though everyone decided that they hated me because they decided to believe and listen to my perpetrator. And so I was being triggered and re-traumatized every single day, but I had this vision of I will walk across that graduation stage and he will not take that away from me again. And I think what I would say is that although not everyone has the access to transferring, I know in DC for me, you can apply to transfer to a different school district, or you can request it or submit an appeal. I'm not sure what the process is in different states for different people, but for me, I would say that nothing is worth putting yourself through daily suffering and surrounding yourself with people who don't support you and don't embrace you and don't uplift your experience, because that will make for so many more years of suffering than the giving up of one experience for a much more positive overall one. And I came to that conclusion a month into my junior year of high school when I realized I just couldn't take it anymore. And I called my mom and I said, I can't go back there. I just can't. And she picked me up and we never went back to that school again. And again, I feel really lucky that I have a support system at home that was willing to kind of whisk me away and just completely give up on that school when I was ready to, and was waiting for me to become ready to do that. But I would say that it can feel like justice is a really narrow path. And you can visualize what that is, especially in a really, really emotional aftermath of violence taking place. And it can feel like it can only be this one thing, and you have to pursue it with all that you have. And I think I would say to someone, let your vision of justice change as you change and as your circumstances change, because it can just be so much more detrimental to yourself to stay in a situation where you're pursuing something that you were suited to pursue a while ago, maybe 2 years ago, but you are not in the situation to now.
I love that idea of imagining the word justice and how that shifts throughout a survivor or anybody's life. And one instance of the shift in the definition of justice that I would imagine is the decision to apply to college and to go somewhere for your secondary education. And so you went to, and just recently graduated from, congratulations, Temple University. And there you talk a lot about, in your work and your writing, about the student group that you founded and really brought to life on their campus. And, in fall of 2023, you held the first meeting of a new student organization, organization called Student Activists Against Sexual Assault. And we know that 20 students attended the first meeting with your leadership, is that correct? And with your leadership, it grew to over 500, to almost 500 members. Can you share with our listeners what it was like to start this organization, especially coming from that place of finally, realizing what justice means to you and leaving an institution that failed you, and how you grew the membership and how you worked together with other students to have the enormous impact that you had on Temple's campus?
Yeah, absolutely. So I went to college with the intention of not being a survivor and not labeling myself that way and kind of disaffiliating from all that people had associated with me, because when I transferred high schools, I had that same mindset of I'm not going to tell a soul because I don't want anyone to know. I don't want anyone to connect me to this. And I don't want to repeat the cycle that just occurred for the last, who knows how, X amount of years since 8th grade. And so I at the same time, still wanted to find an environment where I could feel validated and feel like I was contributing to something, because in high school, that was my only outlet, working at Break the Cycle. But my intention was to just find the club that I assumed would exist on any college campus, because I think when we picture college, we picture protests and we picture picket lines, and I just assumed and imagined that there would be a space like that on my campus, especially post-Me Too. And so I thought, I'll sit in the back of every meeting. I won't say a word, but it will feel good for me to be there. And it was listed as active on my university's website, Student Activists Against Sexual Assault. And so I imagined that it would be at our club fair when I first got to Weeks of Welcome at Temple. And I remember doing 3 laps and just feeling like I was crazy, because I was like, I can't find this org anywhere. And so I emailed their advisor, who was the Title IX coordinator at the time, and asked, where is this club? Were they not tabling for some reason? Is there a way that I can join without participating in the Weeks of Welcome? And I got an email back saying, this club has been inactive for 4 years or 5 years. Are you interested in restarting it? And I said yes hesitantly, because I knew I needed that space, but I still felt like I don't want anyone to know that I am doing this or a part of this, because I just want to be Ray, and I just want to have my name be my name and not be attached to anything else. And so kind of quietly behind the scenes, I started putting together the structure of this student organization and the pitch process that they make you go through at a university to kind of acquire funding and become a valid student organization. And they make you recruit 10 people. And so I started kind of building up the courage to ask 10 people in my life if they would sign on to support something like this, while feeling like even asking someone to join an organization felt like disclosing that I had an experience myself. And in that process, what I learned the most was I want to build a space where people don't feel like going there and being a part of it means that they're saying that they're a survivor, or means that they're publicly disclosing or sharing something. And so it became really important to me to have a space that didn't feel exclusive to survivors, that felt like a lot of people could be in the same room, so it didn't feel like you were this kind of central focal point when you opened the door and you took your seat and found it. And so I started brainstorming with the 10 people that I started recruiting from my dorm hall. How can we do something beyond, really, really specific programming that's only going to attract people that are really open about their experiences for the most part? Because even coming up to our table is going to feel like they're exposing themselves or making themselves vulnerable if somebody's watching them that they don't want to know, or they don't want their classmates to perceive them as being interested in anti-sexual assault work because it sounds like it was inspired by a past experience. And over time, by my sophomore year, we started building out a big male engagement amount of programming. And through that, I think, and having so many people that often are not represented in that space and often are not speaking in that space and contributing to conversations and increasing kind of campus media coverage in our kind of school newspaper, people started to feel more comfortable coming to meetings, because it didn't feel like when you walked in that door, you were accepting or embracing or branding yourself with some sort of label. It just felt like a community where you could learn, and a community of care and of empowerment, but not one where you had to share by even entering the room without opening your mouth to say something. And I think that's what made the org successful, was having a space like that for everyone, and not it being something where people felt vulnerable in walking in the room.
Yeah, that's such an amazing and impactful ethos as well. I think that that's something that the criminal legal system has to take a hard look at, especially with the way that they rely so heavily on victims in the criminal legal process. I dream someday of a system that does not force the victim to have to go through the entire re-traumatizing process and have to be dragged through the mud to be able to see some sort of acknowledgement, and also dream of a completely different legal system. But that's another topic for another time. But yeah, that ethos is so admirable.
It's also just such a reminder of the power of young people, at I Have the Right To. We're so lucky to have so many incredible interns, high school and college, that are just doing incredible things. And I think that sometimes people forget how powerful young people are and what they can accomplish and what they can do. And especially when they have adults in their lives that are supporting them. It sounds like you had support of your mom, during the process. You were able to call her, and when you were in middle school, and then even when you wanted to leave, like her supporting that decision. And even just the person who responded back to you when you said that about the club, when they asked you if you wanted to start it up again, instead of just being like, no, that doesn't exist, the ask of, well, do you want to start it up? Can you talk a little bit about just how have, adults in your life, whether it was, a parent or other people, now you are an adult, but when you were younger, how did they support you? How did, whether it was a professor or a parent or, just educator, in your life?
I feel really lucky that I very early on encountered a professor who wasn't even my own professor, but was in the College of Public Health, so very much outside of my scope and field. But she was doing research on restorative justice on campus, and she was looking for people to interview, and I signed up to participate in one of the informational interviews, and we immediately clicked, and afterwards she became the advisor for my organization, and she just became this superhero powerhouse that every time administrators retaliated or weren't working with us or were violating some sort of policy in not serving students or retaliating against student survivors, she was there, and she made time to show up to meetings to make sure that people did take young voices seriously, because that is such a problem, especially in institutional university settings, because you're only there for 4 years. You've probably only gotten involved in work where you're meeting with them by the time you only have 2 or 3 years left. And so they can easily wait you out. So having an ally who can be in the room and make them take you seriously right then and there, before they can delay a meeting, before they could leave someone off of an email so that you have to have another meeting and another meeting and another meeting, and suddenly you're in a different state because you've graduated, is so important. And I think, again, something that contributed to the success of our organization, because we had so many adults in our corner. And through her, I think that network expanded. And I feel very lucky that the college I was in, also of media and communication, which houses journalism, and my own major, were so supportive. And I couldn't think of a better college to house a club like this, even though someone might think maybe liberal arts, where gender studies lives, would be a better fit. Being underneath the school of freedom of the press and of being able to push the boundaries, I think was actually a much more beneficial and advantageous decision, because those are the types of administrators who have field experience in pushing back against institutions, in holding institutions accountable in a way that a college of liberal arts will never be able to measure up to, because that's just not the same industry, and that's just not the same experience as writing PhD papers, right? And so they were very much wanting to make space when administrators wouldn't. They would offer to house panels for us, to give us additional space for events to hold when the student center wasn't letting us book space, and trying to get in the way of us holding events that were really important for students.
Yeah, I think your approach to the environment of the club is so impactful, especially with the male-directed programming, just as a way to involve as many youth voices as possible. I love what you said about the community of care and empowerment, and clearly others feel the same way, because your leadership in student activists against sexual assault was showcased when the club was selected for a collection of grants totaling in $350,000 from Uber for Temple students. Would you be able to share with us how you initiated that process, and if that monumental win for Temple students changed your club's relationship to the university, both on an administrative side and on the student side?
Yeah, absolutely. That partnership was definitely, I think, a high point of our entire experience as a club so far, and of my college experience for sure. Through It's On Us, they were trying to pilot a experimental program of giving students free vouchers for unsafe and vulnerable situations. Like if you'd had too much to drink and you couldn't get back home, maybe your friends left a party without you, which is all too common during especially the red zone time period of school, where people really don't have solidified friendships or don't know what it means to be a true friend yet, because we're all coming from different backgrounds and different experiences and maybe varying levels of friendship experience. So we don't know to stand by each other. We don't know the buddy system quite yet. So especially for instances like those, that was why the partnership was born. And then It's On Us was to select their most active chapter to be the beneficiary of that grant. And so that year, that was our chapter, SASA, and that really, really quickly launched. So around a month after we started having that conversation, the initial wave, which was, I believe, $200,000 in grants, was launched. So students could claim up to 4 vouchers at a time into their account. And by the end of 48 hours, they were all gone. And so not only do I think that it kind of changed our relationship to students, because it made us a resource and a club that much, much, much more people were aware of all of a sudden, because it was just such a high profile and high news coverage event. But it also changed our relationship to the city and our capacity to impact change much further beyond Temple's kind of patrol zone and boundary area, but also across Pennsylvania and working with City Hall. So many opportunities were born out of that one opportunity that was so great, but it snowballed into so many more amazing projects and so many more amazing opportunities to meet with council members and to meet with rape crisis centers in the area, and eventually to meet with legislators for a bill that we've been working on. So it was a great, great partnership, but it led to so many more things that I think have had a much more long-term impact than the thing that got the most coverage out of that, that I always love to spotlight.
That's incredible that many vouchers were used in that short amount of time. I think probably that alone raised so much awareness of this many young people felt that they were potentially in an unsafe situation, and just the need to have options to get them home safely. So even that alone, I feel like is so impactful and had to have gotten the attention of a lot of people, like you said, that you went on to collaborate with. When you were just talking, you mentioned the red zone. We're quickly approaching August, and people will be going on to college campuses, and for a freshman, it will be their first time going away to college. And I really try to work with seniors as much as I can to just raise awareness about this. When I was at my firm, I represented a lot of survivors who were sexually assaulted during red zone. So can you just share a little bit about red zone? As you know, it's the first few months of the fall semester when more than 50% of college campus sexual assaults occur, roughly August through November. So what do you think is important for college students to know, high school seniors who just graduated and are going off to college? Just, some things that you would like for them to know, or if their parents are listening, things you think their parents need to know before they go off to school.
I think to preface the advice that I would give to younger people is I want to say that this is information that your college should be giving you, but that you won't receive. And in the meantime, while your colleges are learning very, very, very slowly to adapt their protocol and adapt the way that they equip students with resources and prepare them for those first few weeks, unfortunately, it is important to learn them on your own and to become familiar on your own. And I guess the advice that I would give that a college should be providing you with is to familiarize yourself with where all of the resources are on campus. Because of the Violence Against Women Act, during your orientation or before you arrive on campus, you do have to have some sort of programming discussing sexual violence and discussing the existence of resources, but it's so vague in terms of how much information they have to give you and how much time they have to spend on it. They could fit all of the things that they have to give you to check off that box legally on one slide. And it's likely something you won't be paying attention to because you're overwhelmed by that first week. You're trying to make friends by talking to the person next to you during that presentation maybe, or it's a click-through module that you can ignore. And I know that I clicked through my orientation module because I didn't know that any of the information was important, let alone was it engaging? Absolutely not. So I would say familiarizing yourself with the resources on campus, not only for yourself and not in a way of this will happen to you and you need to be equipped and prepared, but it will happen to someone that you know, most likely. And although that's a terrifying and disappointing and ugly reality, getting hit with it as something that you weren't ready for is so much more scary than having it be something that you realize in the first week when you hear about the first 4 sexual assaults in your dorm at the party that you were at and you felt safe at. But something else happened to someone that you know who lives across the hall from you. And that is something that we should be preparing people for in advance and walking them through and giving them the tools to be supportive to the person who maybe decides to confide in you because they trust you. And why should you know how to respond? Because no one's told you how. So also knowing how to support a survivor and knowing how to respond in the moment and be validating is something that's important to not jump to vilification of the perpetrator, which is always the instinct because you don't know that person's relationship to the perpetrator. It might be a really confusing relationship that just got much more confusing because of an assault, because it might have been someone they loved. It might have been a family member. And so they might have complicated feelings about that individual, and we can't dictate the way that that person feels about them, even though it's the instinct. I would also say beyond knowing your Title IX resources, knowing the Rape Crisis Center in your state and what resources they might offer. Because although what we are taught when we go to college or what we can learn from the internet or from a podcast like this is that Title IX is the resource on your campus, it is not always a reliable system of support. And it's also not a system which will provide you with resources and equip you with resources outside of the context of your university, because it is beneficial to them to keep things as internal as possible. And so they're not going to tell you about the support groups in your city that are free and accessible and not something that you have to pay for through therapy, or not something that you need insurance for that your Rape Crisis Center is offering. And these are obviously a load of resources to familiarize yourself with, and one is absolutely enough. To know one thing and be that person is so much more than almost anyone will be able to say, because no one is being taught these things. And so if you can just offer one bit of support, whether it's knowing how to support a survivor and how to respond and be validating, because that is such a big predictor of their long-term success in overcoming and recovering from their sexual assault. Just being kind is such a monumental thing to do. But also knowing to refer them to a Rape Crisis Center, knowing a hotline to call, or knowing to tell them, hey, Title IX might not be for everyone, just so you know, this might not be the process that you want to go through, because it might be re-traumatizing, but it's also, if you feel like you want to report, that's an option, and here's where you can find the office on campus.
Yeah, what you said about the impact of not having those solidified friendships at the start of the school year, that's something I've really never considered. And you said that even with these rocky relationships, that even if something doesn't happen to you, you will know someone maybe in your hall that is a victim. You touched on this, but beyond how peers can better support survivors in their lives, can you talk about the importance that peers serve as upstanders versus bystanders?
Yes. So I think that, again, this is something that universities should absolutely be teaching, and this is something that high schools should be teaching before students go off to college. But it can kind of feel like when you're in a situation where you can be an active bystander, where you can intervene, and you have the opportunity to intervene, it can be really daunting and overwhelming because you might not know the situation. You might feel like somebody else will. I know the bystander effect is very real, where you feel like I don't need to do something because someone else is better equipped to, or someone else is much more likely to intervene. And then nobody does because everyone feels that way. And so this is the big part of the trainings that we do on campus with the fraternities, is equipping people with real ways that feel comfortable to intervene. There are many types of intervention that a lot of people don't necessarily know or aren't familiar with, beyond direct intervention, like what we imagine, where you just step in between two people and things maybe escalate from that, or there's a risk of it escalating, and you socially don't want to put yourself in that situation because you're trying to make a good impression on all these people at the beginning of the year. And also, you don't know what's going on necessarily. If you don't know the two people, you don't know the dynamic, you don't know if something's actually wrong, and you don't want to mispredict or miscalculate what's going on. So beyond direct intervention, there's delegation. So deferring to someone else. Maybe if you're at a bar or you're at a frat party and there's a sober designated brother who's supposed to act as security, which many Greek systems have, or there's 18 plus bars in some areas, so freshmen could be at them, deferring to a security guard and having them get involved and having them be the person who's potentially putting themselves at risk by intervening in that situation. There are also, you could grab a friend and you could go up to someone together because it's a lot less scary to do that with someone else than to do it alone. There's distraction, where you can say, hey, my friends and I were talking over here. Do you want to come with me? Or if you saw two people arguing on the street, you could say, hey, I think your car is being towed, or something along those lines, to help get someone out of a situation where maybe a stranger has come up to them and is harassing them. And you know that they wouldn't know if that person had a car nearby or was in that situation, just for example. These are all things that we are not taught and most of us are not familiar with. And so we think that our only option is to put ourselves at harm's way to potentially stop a situation that might not even be as serious as we're perceiving it to be. And that can feel like such a risk and such a liability that almost no one will participate or actually take action. So knowing the other ways that you can de-escalate a situation are definitely very important, especially as someone entering college, where you'll be in all these situations and settings where alcohol is being drunk and dynamics are changing and you're observing a lot happening at parties where things are escalating.
What you said about the social pressure of making a good impression in the first few months really stuck with me. I feel like that's something that high schoolers and college students will always grapple with. But I guess, how can these students best navigate the new environment and distinguish between the normal social anxieties of being in this brand new environment and actual warning signs when it comes to trusting your gut?
I think in the long term, it's changing the culture, right? And having it be a cool thing to actually stand up for people and having it be the right thing that is socially acceptable. But in the meantime, knowing that you should trust your gut is something that is really, really hard to grapple with in college, like you said, because it often feels like your gut contradicts the situation that you are in socially. It can often feel like if you're being told by your instincts to get out of somewhere, the friends that you just met in your hallway, and it feels like you need to hang on to those relationships and kind of cling to them, don't want to leave the situation, then I think 9 times out of 10, that situation is going to win and you're going to stay with your friends, because it feels like you need that support system much more than you need to listen to something that maybe is off or maybe is just an off vibe that you're misinterpreting. But finding people that you can trust is important, and also recognizing that good people who will be good friends to you, who will serve you well in college in the long term, are people that will listen to your gut just as much as you want to, and people that you should be able to confide in about a gut feeling. And if they don't respond well to it, it's absolutely not the end of the world if you leave a social situation. And this kind of ties back to that welcome week where you feel this urgency to hang on to the first people that you meet. You've probably heard that the joke that the people that you meet in college your first week are the people you'll maybe never see again for the rest of college, even though they feel like your best friends for the first week because you go through so many new experiences together. But if those people aren't in the same lane as you and aren't willing to adapt with you and aren't willing to exit a situation with you, or you don't feel comfortable necessarily telling them that you want to leave, then those aren't your people. And I guarantee that those people would have changed or exited your kind of social circle in a more natural way later down the line if you still didn't say anything. And so I think just getting comfortable with the fact that you're not going to miss out on the rest of college, you're not going to miss out on friendships because you leave a situation that feels unsafe and because you happen to be educated enough to recognize a red flag that other people don't want to see necessarily or don't want to recognize, even if you point it out, is okay, even though it's a really, really difficult thing to accept.
So much of that is so helpful to hear, even as somebody who's outside of college. It's a great reminder, I think, constantly to keep on re-engaging with the people that you keep around you and sort of keep on thinking about how you guys interact and how we deal with each other and how we support each other and if we have the same sort of morals or ideas of what it means to be a good friend and practice consent within friendships and relationships. And so much of this advice that you've given us so far and in your work as well is so amazing. And I think it's really important to recognize and to emphasize what you said earlier, that a lot of it's, or maybe none of it's coming from the institutions themselves. These are things that people have to seek out by listening to or reading things written by activists and advocates like yourself, or listening to podcasts like this. And I did want to get back to something that you spoke or mentioned briefly a little bit ago about the work that you've been doing in the legislature in Pennsylvania and your advocacy around the House Bill 1279, which you are a co-author of. I read through it a little bit today, and so much of what you were saying about access and information and the way that these modules are even created and the way that you really want to prevent students from just clicking through these modules is so important. And I just wanted to ask you, what was it like to co-author a bill? And if you could dilute for us the goal of this piece of legislation and where it stands now.
Yeah, I think the opportunity to get involved in a policy space versus the direct survivor support space was really groundbreaking for me, because when I've been in this work for almost a decade, which is kind of crazy to say as somebody who's 22, but I think you meet so many survivors when you are in this space and you hear the same story over and over again of institutional betrayal, of ways that this maybe could have been prevented by better sexual education, by better information, or at least ways that this person could have been better supported and received the help that they needed at a much more fast pace if they were just familiar with the things that a school is responsible for equipping you with and for making sure that you know, but still fails to do so every single year for decades, makes you kind of feel like hopeless in a way at times, even though I so admire the work of victim advocates and their ability to every day just support people through direct experiences. But for me, I think I found my biggest passion in wanting to do something bigger to prevent the next person from having the same story versus hearing the same story so frequently, which I was so used to and accustomed to hearing and was getting to be so debilitating. Although that's still part of the work that I do, I think expanding into a space that felt like it had the capacity to influence culture and law, those two things together make me so much more hopeful than doing survivor support work in isolation. In terms of co-authoring the bill, getting to kind of learn the legalese language that is so inaccessible and often a barrier to young people as well, because it's this fancy language that is created without young people in mind, without access in mind, without legibility and comprehension in mind, because they want it to be something that only people with the highest education and the highest experience can understand for accountability purposes, was so empowering, because it gave me the capacity to better explain things and to bring in youth to a space that is so often inaccessible and kind of red taped off from youth. And getting to be a part of a project like that has been so, so empowering and just completely reinvigorated me in a way that survivor support was just in isolation on its own really not able to do for me after so long of hearing the same thing. And feeling like there was so much overwhelming bipartisan support in all of the legislative meetings that I've had. Although our sponsorship is still leaning left, we do have one Republican co-sponsor. But in all of the meetings that we've had with Republicans, the feedback has been really, really positive. And I've also noticed that with Republicans and Democrats alike, they have the same questions. And so for me also, not only has it been an empowering experience to learn about the law and to write a law, but it's also been really helpful for me to understand that no matter what your political affiliation is, no matter what issues you're focused on, the baseline understanding of sexual assault in the legislative space, at least in Pennsylvania, is equal across the board. And it's low. It's very, very low. But it's the same. And at the end of the day, I think the legislators I've met with have the same concerns, which has also been reinvigorating, because we can kind of get caught up in these bubbles where we hear news pieces and we hear about decisions and we hear about laws being passed in different areas that can kind of box people in to a sort of archetype in our heads. And for me, hearing that people have the same desires when it comes to sexual assault, but they just don't understand it fully. And if they were to understand it on a different level, on a more thorough level, and if there were to be more youth people in this spaces and young people speaking about their experiences, I think we would be able to make much more progress. And so getting to be a part of the Every Voice Coalition, which is how I got involved in this law, which is coaching many, many other states, has been really, really inspiring to know that that's happening not just in Pennsylvania, but it's going to be happening in Washington. It's been happening in DC. It's happened in so many other states as well.
Ray, that's incredible. Your advocacy around that has been really amazing, and we have definitely been following that journey and will continue to follow it. And we hope that you'll keep us updated so that we can update all of our followers and also in our newsletter, because I know people are interested to see what happens next. So also other exciting news. I know that you recently received the prestigious Truman Scholarship for Outstanding Leadership Potential in Public Service. As part of this, you'll receive a monetary award toward a public service related degree. So can you share what you've been up to since graduation, what your plans for the future are, and what your next few years are going to look like?
Yeah, so this summer I've been participating in the Summer Institute program through the Truman Foundation, which awarded that graduate scholarship for future graduate studies. They have as many people from our cohort who are able to secure an internship or a job in DC come to DC and live in the George Washington University dorms while they participate in weekly seminars on Tuesdays, where each of us give things called true talks. They love to put true in front of every word in our community. We each give presentations sort of on our issue area or on something personal to us. Some of them are more lighthearted. I definitely tried to make mine more lighthearted than to just be, again, the girl who talks about sexual assault. But through that program, I've been interning at the U.S. District Court for Magistrate Judge Zia Faruqi, who is one of the best bosses I've ever had in my life. He is a really, really inspiring judge, and he's really demonstrated and taught me what procedural justice looks like in a courtroom where you treat everyone with respect and try to be as restorative as possible in a traditional legal setting and institutional setting. So I really feel like I've learned a lot from that experience. And then in the evenings, I've been teaching a night class with the Every Voice Coalition, where I'm coaching with my boss, Andrew Eccles, who's the executive director, 4 state teams. So Washington, future Pennsylvania state directors potentially, and future legislative leads for the organization, DC and Virginia, on how to pass a variation of the same bill in their own states, and for PA to continue the work that's being done in PA already, as myself and my co-state director at some point will not have the time or be in law school or no longer be students. So kind of figuring out how to pass the torch in the event that the law doesn't pass, or just for the implementation stage, which is something that we need serious commitment for as well. And I, in September, will be working for Rocky Mountain Victim Law Center in Denver. I'm moving there on Monday, actually. I'm very excited to make that move across the country. And I'll be a client services intern there. So essentially a victim advocate in training. After an extensive amount of training, I'll have my own caseload, and I'll get to accompany people to court. And they work on Title IX hearings and Title IX cases throughout the state. So they serve beyond just the Denver area. They help with civil protection orders and things along those lines. So I'm really excited for that experience, and I'll be applying to law school throughout that job.
That's amazing. It's so important to bring others in. So I'm sure we're going to have listeners that are going to want to know how to get involved in some of the stuff that you're doing, including the legislative work. So how could they, be one of the people that you're passing the torch to as you move on to different big, exciting things?
I love that question. So people can get involved with the Every Voice Coalition at the link in their bio, Every Voice Coalition on Instagram, or you can visit their website. There are Join the Movement forms for the current states that have active chapters, where you can join a steering committee. Very, very low commitment depending on the role that you want, or you can have a high commitment role as well. So you can get involved in legislative meetings, you can get involved in canvassing students and meeting with community partners, and just recruiting support for a piece of legislation, or even potentially becoming a co-author in states that we're brand new in terms of adapting it for the current legislature, in terms of adapting it for the laws that are already in place that might contradict pieces of the mother bill. So those are ways to get involved. And you can also get involved in the summer. So next summer, you can apply for the Next Generation Leaders Fellowship, which is what I was teaching this summer. So it's a stipend experience. So it's something where survivors or allies or advocates are really encouraged, but also financially validated for the work that they're doing, which is really rare in this space. And very difficult in this space, just because funding is so difficult to come by, especially nowadays. So having that experience, I think, is really, really helpful and builds a great foundation if you want to get involved in a really great capacity. You get a lot of foundational information. You learn how to analyze VAWA and Clery data, and how to compare it among states, how the bill has affected that data and transparency in different states where it has passed versus states where it hasn't passed. You also get to learn how to write testimony, how to write op-eds and letters to the editors. It is such a comprehensive and fulfilling and great experience to have during the summer. So highly recommend that as well if you're looking for something compensated.
That's amazing, and that's so great to hear of concrete, actual opportunities for youth activists. Because I feel like the space can feel kind of daunting, especially when you're young. But I did want to ask as well, looking ahead, is there anything that sort of gives you a bright, shining light of hope for the future of student activism and advocacy to prevent sexual violence? And are there any trends or movements you've seen recently that really inspire you?
I think in terms of giving me hope, being somebody who's teaching future advocates this summer has been a different perspective for me that has been so fulfilling in a really surprising way. Seeing other people do the same work and get prepared to take over that work has been again, so reinvigorating for me because it makes me hopeful for the next generation of leaders, even though I know I'm still very much in the current generation, I like to think. But seeing young people who are passionate about the same thing in a space where loneliness is such an epidemic and can make you feel like you are the only person who cares. Sometimes, especially initially, you are the only person with your own experience initially. Just being in a group of people that have shared life experience, that care about something the way that you do, that see the same hope in legislative change and how law influences culture and can influence student activism and enhance it, and also take a burden off of student survivors who are working to educate people right now, again, in the way that their universities are absolutely obligated to be doing, but continue to fail to do, is so on a combinational level empowering for me. And for the future, it's also something that gives me hope being in this legislative space and learning what really feels like the future of change to me is legislation. Finding that part of myself has been really empowering, and figuring out that what I want to do is to continue to write laws and watch the way that even talking about laws that have been introduced that haven't necessarily passed influence culture in themselves, if they're able to get enough attention, has been just so powerful and so healing in a way that I hadn't experienced before.
You have just accomplished so much already, and it's clear your passion drives everything you do. What is one message you want young advocates, or even those who are just starting to find their voices, to take away from this conversation?
I think the most important lesson I learned, which was more recent than it should have been, was that your story as a survivor is not your only tool in your advocacy toolkit. And you might encounter a lot of spaces when you're trying to get involved in advocacy work where it feels like centering your story of sexual violence and centering your experience can be kind of exploitative, and there's a lot of pressure to share. And if you're comfortable sharing, and that's something that I'm comfortable talking about, it can also become really normalized to share it in every space that you are in, and for that to define your expertise. But I think my main lesson that I've learned and my main message to other advocates is that your voice and your expertise comes from your existence as a student, as somebody on the ground who is experiencing rape culture of your generation and can speak to it. And it does not need to come from your sexual assault or your experience of harassment or your experience of domestic violence growing up or now currently. That is not the only tool in your toolkit. Your voice and your other experiences and just your passion are absolutely sufficient and just as effective and just as powerful, especially when you're sharing with legislators, when you're sharing with administrators who will build advisory councils and committees out of students solely for the reason that they are students. And so the fact that that changes in sexual assault spaces is something that I think we need to move away from. And that if you're comfortable sharing your story and it's empowering, then of course that is an option, and that is helpful for people to know that they are not alone, and it's insightful and it can provide insight to administrators who might not be familiar with that experience. But it is not the only thing that is important. And to get involved in this work, you should not feel like you need to brand yourself or define yourself as a survivor. You can just be a person and just be you.
Wow, that gave me goosebumps. It's so true. I think that it's such an important reminder for survivors that they can share what feels right to them, and they don't have to share what doesn't. And that might change from day to day. What you felt comfortable sharing a year ago might be different than today, and nobody should pressure you into anything that you're not feeling comfortable with in that moment. So there are so many other things that I could ask you, and we might need to bring you on for a second episode because I know that there's just so many other things that the three of us would love to talk about. But I know that we're at time. So before we get off, I did have one last question I wanted to ask you. So we often ask our guests to complete an "I have the right to" statement. So just what that phrase means to you, how you would complete that statement, and what that would mean to you.
That whole phrase and this whole organization's name has meant so much to me growing up because it was the first encounter I had with another experience that was the same as your book, Chessy. I used to listen to it on tape in the hallways at my high school to get myself out of my kind of just triggered and traumatized state. Like, I would restart it as soon as it finished every single time. I think I've read it hundreds of times at this point. And so for me, it means, just finishing that sentence is so difficult because I feel like I have the right to, and other people have the right to feel the way that that book made me feel every second following their experience, and to feel just that they're not alone. I have the right to be believed and to be validated. And I think other people have that right to feel that way initially and not have to seek out a amazing advocate to tell them that through some audiobook. They should be told that by the first person who responds to them. And it's not a perfect sentence answer, but I think that the way that that book makes people feel and the way that that book was there for me was the way that everyone who is a survivor is entitled to be made to feel initially.
Oh my gosh, you made me cry now. So thank you so much, Ray. Thank you. And I'm so happy that we're connected and we're so not alone in this. And you've created such a beautiful coalition of people and advocates and activists and family. And I'm so happy and proud to know you and to be able to witness your work in the world.
Yeah, hearing your journey and everything you've done just makes me feel so inspired and hopeful for what students can accomplish when we come together. Thank you so much for empowering not only your peers, but also those of us who are just starting our own advocacy journeys.
It inspires me a lot to see young people like you also, Charlotte, in this space, and to see high schoolers care about this. And so I hope you feel really proud of yourself for being here as well and for doing the work that you're doing, because I know it's really, really difficult to put yourself in that position at a young age and to, again, associate yourself with work like this. And so you are amazing for doing this too.
Yeah, thank you so much. That means so much.
It has been an absolute pleasure and privilege to be with the three of you and to have this conversation. To our listeners, remember, activism doesn't have to start big. It starts with one conversation, one idea, one moment of courage. We'll be back soon with more conversations to empower and inspire you to create safer, more supportive communities. And remember, you have the right to.
Thank you so much for listening. Like and subscribe to the podcast on all platforms. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends about Aspire, the I Have the Right To podcast. Visit IHaveTheRightTo.org to learn more about our programming for students, educators, and parents, as well as internship opportunities. And don't forget to follow us on social media at I Have the Right To. Until next time, stay empowered and keep the conversations going.